So I'm delighted today to have with me a special guest, Gary Edwards.
Oh, what a delight to be here with you and with the many participants. This is obviously such a great topic. My right to an opinion on this topic. I've been working with TrustArc for a number of years on some research that we do on a global basis on the topic of privacy. And my own background is in the area of survey research and business analytics. A couple of highlights. I used to run Gallup Canada, the Gallup poll, as you may all know it, built and helped pioneer a customer experience management firm and have spent a lifetime in around business analytics. So that's the lens at which I view privacy, and it's proven to be particularly helpful on this topic, which is burgeoning world of AI. Thank you again for having me here today, Paul.
Thank you, Gary, for joining us. As always, great to have you. I am the current customer enablement lead at TrustArc and also lead our data privacy discussions in-house and within our customers. Prior to me joining TrustArc, I was Chief Privacy Officer at the Kellogg Company. So I'm delighted to be here sharing the stage. So the agenda for today will be something like this. We're going to kind of do a quick AI landscape overview. I think it's always important to ground ourselves a little bit. Then we'll obviously get into a lot of the great research that Gary has done in integrating privacy by design in SDLC, or the software development lifecycle. Why AI makes privacy especially critical today. What are the next steps that you kind of need to take? And we will give you very tangible things to do. This isn't going to be one of those 30,000-foot discussions. While we'll have moments of that, we will get into some nitty and grit of our discussion. And then finally, we'll sum it up with questions and answers from you guys. So with that, Gary, we're going to get going. So just kind of a couple of key definitions. I think it's always important to do this. Obviously, there's plenty of buzz out there over the AI particularly this past year. But, a lot of us are still learning as we go along, and we don't want to leave anyone out. And so we want to make sure we're reminded of some key definitions when discussing AI. Obviously, the artificial intelligence, right? The simulation of the human intelligence in machines, the automated systems. I think the important thing here is work being done with minimal or very limited or no human intervention. Generative AI, we hear about this all the time, and that is where content is generated, and it could be text, video, imagery, and so forth. The other one that we hear quite often now is these large language models, and making sure everyone understands that these are, these large-scale, complex data warehouses that have a deep learning algorithm, and they train huge quantities of text using a self-supervised learning to predict and generate that text as you go forward. So this is obviously one of the areas of great concern to a lot of folks, particularly in the area of copyright, in a lot of the creative area. And then regenerative AI is kind of the emerging field where basically the machine regenerates itself or repairs itself, and it course corrects as it learns differently going forward. So those are just a couple of key definitions. Some we will certainly refer to in this discussion, but I think it's always best to kind of touch base with that. Gary, do you have any other things you'd like to add?
I mean, just one, the obvious, which is these are not exclusive. This is all the world that we're being immersed in, whether we want to be or not. It's here, and it's not going away. I guess I would just offer, when we think of definitions, we also just want to think what's purpose. And purpose of AI should be to augment our human capabilities and our well-being. And so I think we can start from a good place, which is there's a lot of potential here, while also being very cognizant of the risks. Especially around, Paul, this notion of building up off machine learning, and now we've got AI systems generating, whether it's text for us or code or what have you. We have to remember that basically what AI is doing, even if you don't have a background in mathematics or computer science, but it's building on patterns from data that a human being has provided it. Somebody's pointed AI, the AI tools, at certain data sets, and it's been optimized to understand that data. It doesn't inherently possess good judgment or bad judgment. It's an amoral system, not immoral, amoral. It's not necessarily, even though we want to use it for good, obviously there's bad actors out there and we have to be aware of its risk, as well as we just have to be aware all the time in life when new opportunities come our way of any sort of unintended consequences, even if our intents are good. So I just wanted to point that out from the onset, that essentially AI has sort of broadened the risk surface, is the way I like to think of it, without any necessary increased boundaries around how we ethically contain it. And so I think a lot of our discussion today is going to be, look, it's not really a discussion of are we going to use it or not? What's the appropriate ways to use it, and how do we put some ethical boundaries around it that's used for its original purpose to augment our well-being.
I think it's great point, Gary, and so true, because if you attend any of these privacy functions or these active discussion groups that are online, it's there's quite a bit of fear there. And as you and I have discussed offline, there's a false assumption out there that everything that is generated by these tools are somehow factual, when we know that it was a human being that entered the information in. And if they were wrong, bad data in is bad data out, right? And all these things. So
yeah, the term, I'm sure many, but perhaps not all of the audience knows this, but you should know the word delusion. And I love that fact that folks who built these systems came up with that word, because it's the perfect one. It can easily delude itself and delude you. Part of the large language model features are that it presents a very convincing case, whether or not it's true or not. I had fun early on just asking for an update on privacy regulation, different jurisdictions. And you can get incensed and think, well, it lied to me. It was a lot of it was wrong. But at the same time, it was quite convincing. So we're going to get more into this, but even when you use it, I think it's best used by somebody who has a deep knowledge of the subject matter, so they can call out when they see that delusions are happening and provide better prompts. But we're going to get into all that. It's a good starting place, though, just to understand what are we trying to achieve here? What are some key definitions? Thank you for that, Paul.
Thanks, Gary. And one of the things that, I often hear, even talking with my wife, is, wow, this just came about, right? It's just kind of dropped in from nowhere. And while the news picked it up only recently because of, different discussions and newsworthy events, this has been something that's been in the works for a long period of time. It just didn't happen overnight in this year. And so what this diagram clearly shows is the evolution, right, of us from the very beginning. And Gary, I know you and I are able to talk about those early stages because we lived through those. I remember doing at the university when I was there pages on the internet. They weren't web because the web wasn't around yet, but they were pages on the internet. And, we got excited when it was flashing text and colored text, right? I mean, that was the extent of things back then. But one of the main thing here is it continues to progress, and the machine consciousness, there's a number of books out there where some people are talking about, around 2030, that somehow the machine will surpass the human capability, right? The human mind. So a lot of interesting discussions coming out of that. But the important thing here is this has been evolving. This didn't happen. And so unfortunately, we didn't get quite ahead of it as a society. And that's typical, right? There's a technological disruption that occurs. Then you finally get the social, economic, political, right, backlash, if you will, or the catch up that occurs. And that's kind of where we're at right now as AI was introduced.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of terms that are bandied about, but I like to keep things kind of simple. And so this notion of Web 1, 2, and 3, you hear people talking about, it's really just, I think of it this way. I think through the consumer lens. Web 1.0 was read. You could read stuff. You basically could take things that were physical and represent them digitally. So you could, see the original PDF. You could read a book that way versus having a hard copy in your hand. And then 2.0 was, it started the opportunity to people to share content. So it was read and write. So I could write my book and you could read it and you could review it, Paul. That's read, write. And then Web 3.0 is this semantic web. And you've got a nice list here that illustrates that. But no, will machine become conscious? I think it will I think it's fairly clear now. I give the delusion of consciousness. And if the way it's applied is such that there are feedback loops where AI is talking to AI and it's hooked up to the machines and the machines are making decisions based on AI and there's no human in the loop, it will give a sense, I'm not sure philosophically, I believe we'll really get to machine consciousness, but just as we see delusions now, we'll have systems that if we're not careful without a human in that loop that can make decisions that might not be in our best interest. So again, that's why we're here today. And just to state the obvious, privacy professionals have a rather profound role. They always have, but I think it's become more profound with AI, which is, and you're not the, hey, let's put the brakes on people. I think you're the, let's have our eyes wide open people and make sure which is what we're going to get into next. Let's make sure everything is designed and built from a privacy first perspective.
That's a great segue into the work that you did with TrustArc, Gary. So let's get into it.
Yeah. So thanks, Paul. For several years now, TrustArc has had it's great. You can go online to their website and see it. Some highlights from the research and a white paper you can download. But every year we go out and do a global privacy benchmark survey. It's a 360-degree view. So we look at the viewpoints of executives, managers, frontline employees. We also look at privacy folks, both the executives and the frontline team members. We do this on a global basis. So it's a very, very large, robust study. And we come back and talk about the state of AI, or sorry, the state of privacy. My apologies. This year, and this was just, we fielded the survey early in the year. AI had just sort of hit. A lot of people, are still struggling to know exactly what it is and certainly what it means for them. But it had just sort of hit, and the timing of our survey was such that it was interesting. We listed 18 different types of challenges and had people rate them. And if we just go back a slide.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Of the 18 different challenges, artificial intelligence, as you're seeing here, implications in privacy, it was viewed as most challenging. You take the 4s and the 5s, 47 people were saying, so basically half of those surveyed saw that as the biggest challenge they had. And again, just context is, it just newly hit and immediately went down. Just saying, as soon as it hit, it went right to the top of the pile. If you will, like, oh my gosh, we got to get a handle on this.
Absolutely. So now we're actually going to get into, obviously, looking, as you mentioned, get into a little bit about privacy by design, and how does it applicable, obviously, to the software development lifecycle. So let's talk a little bit about privacy by design, Gary.
Yeah, so it's been around for some years, being around for over 2 decades, I believe, Paul. And 7 key notions. Sure, the audience is very familiar with them. Our point is this. Obviously, if you think of how software is developed, and we're going to get into this from like, I've got an idea to, wow, it's fully out there, and then I'm just, updating it, etc. And people are using it. at every one of these stages, and we're going to walk through them, all 7 of these principles are so important. So I just want to emphasize that. What we're going to do though is just show that, so we're not overwhelmed. Like there's 5 stages of software development, 7 different things you've got to think of by privacy by design. There's some that sort of come to the fore, and as we go through the software development lifecycle, we're going to talk about various elements of the design, privacy by design principles that should be at the forefront of your thinking as a privacy professional. So here are the 5 stages. Somebody's going to design something. They're going to start developing it, get coders in the room, start testing out. These are, it shows it in a circle because although there's a chronology to it, it's an iterative process. Obviously, the minute you start developing, you're starting to test things. Somebody else is stepping in the room and saying, well, what about this? And they're taking all the way back to the design. And, the folks who are coding are frustrated, like, okay, that wasn't one of the requirements, but now we're going to build that in and, so we're going to re-architect this thing. And then, eventually it gets ready for release. As anybody who's been involved in software development, you can't wait till it's perfect. Perfect is the enemy of, just getting stuff done. So it's got to be to a level with, for the business or the consumer that's going to use that application. It's got to be to a place where it won't frustrate them. They'll say, this is the app I want to use or what have you. And then on an ongoing basis, there's, again, iterative process for adding new features, for making sure that it stays current with the environment that it's used in, iOS updates or what have you. It's got to be updated along with that, by way of example. So this whole process is a continuous one, but there's a chronology, and it starts with that first design stage. There's a lot of companies that are developing software. It's not just the way I think it's important for the audience to remember that, especially larger companies and medium-sized companies across many sectors are developing apps all the time. You might not think of them as an app development company, but you go to your bank, that bank has thousands of applications, pieces of their applications that are working at all times. They're definitely software houses. You think of the U.S., the world's largest, most impressive military. Well, they also employ the most software developers of any company in the world. I mean, it's huge. So it's not necessarily what you first think of in terms of, hey, are we just talking about, Apple here? No, we're talking about your bank, the defense. We're talking about obviously retail, and you want to go to a movie, and they've got to have an app. Somebody's developing that. And so in pretty much every sector, any company of any merit size, not all, but most, have some degree of software development that they do themselves or that they deploy for their business. So we're going to walk through how privacy professionals need to think about this.
The design stage, Gary.
Yeah, so I won't read the slide. You're all very intelligent people. You see it here. But the notion, as you read through this list, again, we're just bringing to the forefront the things you really got to think even more about, perhaps, and be really critically aware of here at the design stage. So once you've got a notion, like somebody's got a big idea, that idea has to be run by, hopefully, at least a committee focused on ethics, somebody who's got a privacy. Most companies, what we learned in our global survey of, again, larger companies have privacy teams. Somebody from the privacy team should be in at that original stage. You wouldn't build a house without having some sort of architectural diagram. And so in the architectural diagram, somebody should be able to say, look, I'm not a carpenter. I'm not or the equivalent. I'm not a software engineer. But I'd really like to see where privacy sits in here. I'd really like us to understand where it all fits into what is being proposed. I want to see the original blueprint, and then think through the privacy risks. There's so many apps out there. I think part of the vulnerability we have in the world is it's just think of, and this, we saw a lot of malfeasance with in the world that privacy professionals have been very much focused on. But you're sitting in a restaurant, kids are kind of being noisy, they're distracted. You're like, hey, just play with my phone. What are you going to play? Well, let's download this app. The app is saying, oh yeah, we'll just need to look at all your pictures.
Right.
Look through. Can I read through your emails? And like some of these apps, by the way, just I'm stating the obvious, but just say no. No, we're not going to use that one. But you look through it, and so I think the privacy by design notion is that, look, there's that from a legal standpoint, maybe the person gave their consent, but they didn't. There was an implicit understanding of its use, and so I'm not a lawyer. Again, I'm more on the data analytics and business analytics side, but it's fairly clear when you're looking at that original architecture of what you want to build, that there's an express purpose behind your idea. There's a problem statement that you're solving with your app. And there should be an ethical understanding that since this is the problem we're solving, when we ask permission, we're actually using it for this specific purpose. And it might not be easy to write down what all those purposes are and hand them to the consumer, but that doesn't take away the moral obligation of the company to say, yeah, but we wrote it down. We gathered this information for this purpose. And even though somebody said they gave us permission, it was fairly clear by anybody with any ethical standard why they gave us permission to do certain things. And so, again, lawyers are all over this, but I think as they need to be, and my God, what would you do without them? Lawyers rarely get the praise they need, so I'm praising them here, but also it starts like a step before, which is, okay, so why are you asking that? Why are you getting this data? Let's get the team together and have an understanding of that. So I'm just trying to make it fairly simple and straightforward that the privacy team, at least one member has to be in there, and you need some sort of governing body that oversees applications from the onset. And I think that's critical. Sorry, I'll leave it here, Paul, but you work for a big company, many of us have. If somebody brings it, you just know there's going to be a problem. If somebody brings you in, we're going to get through all the stages. But if they bring you in at stage 5 and say, okay, hey, privacy guy, we need you over here. You're like, okay, I already know this is, you made a mistake. Like, before I even look at the app, I'm like, what? Why are you bringing me in now?
You're
and now I'm just a no person. I want to be the yes person. I want to be the yes person, which means I get involved early, and we have a clear, things get better when you get involved earlier. And so that's my
and that's so true, Gary, and what you're stating, that thankfully I came out of the marketing ranks, if you will. So I kind of knew the marketing processes. And therefore I was able to ask those questions early on at those various stages of development, whether it was software or whatever it was. What are we collecting? Are we collecting personal data? For what purpose? What intent? And are we only collecting what we absolutely need for the next immediate thing? We all know that from a marketing standpoint, they're mentally trying to gather as much as possible, right? So they can leverage that. It's not always leveraged, though, immediately. A lot of them will say, well, I'll never get another chance again to collect this. I want to collect it all up front. Well, you're only asking them to sign up for an e-newsletter. Why do you need, this list of titles and, postal address and all that? You don't. Right. And we're going to see more scrutiny on this, obviously, from the regulations. Anyone following the U.S. Privacy laws that are coming about, just about everyone, there's a few exceptions, but just about everyone has a data minimization principle being followed. So this is, something that we're going to all have to wrestle with. But being open and transparent with your risk team, whether it's in the privacy, security, it doesn't matter. You need to explain what we're trying to do and get everyone on that same page, and do it sooner rather than later, because you're exactly right. You become the no people, and the more you say no, the more they try to work around you. We understand. how that game is played. So, great conversation. So the next one, Gary, development.
Yeah. So here's, you got developers in the room. Big companies, like, these are often huge teams. They can be hundreds, literally thousands of people, and they're developing various applications, and applications form together to form bigger applications. It's the way applications work, right? I think for this one in particular, so now we're developing. We got the idea, we scoped it out, we built requirements. We're going to use, typically, not always, but like, some sort of agile framework where we're constantly, we're doing sprints where every week or 2 weeks, Scrum Master just helping you on your part of the app get things built. There's opportunity for privacy professionals. Again, the methods are very complicated mathematically and computationally. But if you're part of the discussion early on, there's some great data engineering techniques that can be used where individual privacy data or individual PII is masked. And so I think, again, there's an opportunity for privacy professionals to at least get themselves acclimated and somewhat knowledgeable to know what they can ask for, and suggest that, look, if we're going to be collecting, if it's necessary to collect information, like, think of healthcare, where if I want to tailor an experience and do it for the consumer benefit, I'm going to need some access to data. So how can you do that? I think there are lots of methods. We're putting out a white paper shortly on this, but there's the titles are sort of complicated, but the notion and the methods are complicated. But some general understanding of, look, there's these perturbation techniques. You can add some noise to the data, so it's essentially blurring who the individual is. There's cryptographic approaches where you can encrypt data, ensuring that it's not being exposed. You can decentralize things, decentralize data across multiple devices or servers, called federated learning. The list goes on, and there's new ones being developed every day to help data engineers do the task of collecting sensitive information and then masking it so that the original purpose can be met without exposing anyone to the risk of having their privacy violated. So that's one example of, and there's many methods of doing it. It's just where a privacy professional, I think, can be involved early on and say, while you're developing it, we should be thinking of how we can mask some of this data and still use it early on. Again, if you bring me in at the end, somebody says, "Oh, well, we already got it. What do you? I got a warehouse full of personal information. What are you asking me to do?" Well, it would have been better to ask had been, I would like to ask you to have not collected that and stored it in that warehouse. I would have rather you collected it and stored it this way, and then it got used in the data. Think of a data pipeline in the following ways. Again, you don't have to be the expert in how to do it, but you can be an influencer, and you can be a leader and say, this is going to be necessary. We want to use this kind of data for this kind of purpose. We're going to either have to walk away from it or use some of these techniques to make sure that consumer or individual data is being protected.
Yeah, I think the important thing, right, Gary, in all this is, from a privacy lens, right? In order to have the security, right, there certainly needs to be the transparency of what are we doing, what's the purpose, are we sharing this, are we selling this, are we internal, external, right? And there shouldn't be any trade-off. If I want privacy, I shouldn't have a trade-off and get less security, right? I should get both. And that's, from the privacy by design principle, that's the focus, whether it's a widget or a service, you should not have to pick and choose one over the other, but do both, type of thing. So moving on to the next one, testing.
I mean, testing is a perfect application. I know TrustArc is really can be a partner in this in terms of the software that you offer, but always as part of the development process, you're testing all the time, and this is a really important part of the iterative process, that you build it with the purpose of protecting private information, and you test it. You know what I mean? You bring people in, you say, well, okay, your job is to try and break this. You try and figure out, like one of the more obvious ways that uh, data is exposed is when there's, this notion of differential privacy, where if I know this characteristic here and I know that characteristic here, like I do surveys. It's a really simple example. So say all the survey data is anonymous and confidential, but you got 3 people in the Chicago office. Well, you know what I mean? And only one of them is the senior leader. So now if I look at senior leader data and cross-tab it with Chicago, well, I know what that individual said. It's no longer confidential nor anonymous. That's the notion of differential privacy. Is there anything that people could do, whether it's the obvious as I've just explained, but often that gets missed, to more complex systems whereby, especially with AI now, where you could glean from the characteristics that you've got from all these different machine learning models and actually retrace back to individuals. So that's the power of AI. That's how it can be used, whether again by bad actors, or I think in many cases unintentionally. Somebody didn't think through unintended consequences, the power of what these systems can do. And again, the testing stage to make sure that all of that necessary controls and limit and more of the thought process are being put into making sure that privacy can be maintained as that software is being developed.
Yeah, and I think it's, goes without saying, anyone kind of trying to keep up with the changes in privacy right now, from a visibility and transparency, right, of clearly knowing what is going on in your service software as far as touching your personal data. There's an intense scrutiny today, more than ever, in this particular area. And the FTC in the US obviously has made it a core focus for this year alone to really look at, are you doing what you stated you were to do, right? Or are you doing more than you actually, provided notice and told people about? And we're seeing that not only in obviously FTC actions, but it's been echoed, for a future state in where California is going to focus. So to me, really trying to get ahead of this, understanding it in the testing stage, going back to, okay, this is what the service tool is doing, the application is doing. Does it align with what the requirements we talked about and what we stated up front was? If there is more happening, then you likely need to change the privacy notice to actively reflect that, because that's the part will get companies or organizations in trouble. You state one thing in your privacy notice, and somewhere along the line, someone made a decision, not a malicious decision, but a decision to do something more, a secondary purpose for that data. And that's what causes the problems for organizations. So, this whole thing, screams to me, over communication is going to be better than under.
Yes.
Right. Going forward. And, privacy is in risk managers and whatever are going to have to be partners in this, because there's so much going on that no one individual is going to be able to digest it all and apply it going forward.
Absolutely.
So the last stage,
deploy it, got to have end-to-end security. Again, if there's people who work or maybe sit next to the folks who do cybersecurity, it's the whole notion is that we've been talking about is how you shift. Cybersecurity people talk about shifting security left, and it's everything we've been talking about. Also applies to privacy. So you need end-to-end security on these any applications. Got to be doing threat modeling. Threat modeling is an interesting one because some companies only do it so. See, it's really important. This point is, I think, really important because some of what TrustArc offers, which is you can't do threat modeling perhaps on everything. So what do you do it on? You do it on the high risk application. And so what the cybersecurity people are doing, looking at high risk applications, the privacy people need to be doing as well, which is you've cataloged which of these elements of our apps, where we store data, et cetera, which of them are high, medium, or low risk. And of those who are certainly of high risk, you got to be doing some sort of threat modeling, and you've got to be doing some sort of privacy impact assessment. And I think we're going to get to this, but the good news is, AI can be overwhelming, but it doesn't need to be, because the notion is you've already got this. If you know how to do a privacy impact assessment, now you're just pointing that methodology, and it's being updated, but now you're pointing at AI. It's still software, still being developed. There's still humans who are building these models and deploying them and integrating them into the software. And so just like security has to be built in end to end, we've got to make sure that privacy is as well, and all the ethical requirements of accountability, visibility, transparency. We know what we collect. We know why. We can communicate that to people. We have a method for taking people out who want to be taken out. So we thought about that when we were designing it. It's a requirement. And now as you deploy it, you're actually ready to go. And then post deployment, get some feedback. I'm a research guy, so this is perhaps I'm a little biased, but you can never get enough of like user feedback.
Right.
So check, it's part of the dialogue, which is with the human in the loop. It's like you got to check in on each other a lot, and it's like your point, all about communicate. I already mentioned about these deletion retention issues.
Yeah.
They're very hard. They're very hard to, from a software development standpoint, to build in after the fact. But when they're one of the requirements from the onset, obviously from a data engineering standpoint, from a software engineering standpoint, that's built into the requirements from the onset, and your life is the life for everyone, including the privacy professional, is a lot easier.
Absolutely. And obviously, we hear it all the time, whether we call it, individual rights request, data subject access request, data, subject request. There's all sorts of names out there, right?
Right.
That is, if I was in having talked to regulators, one of the key things that they look at, they're always looking at your exterior website, right? They all have to act on complaints. That's a given, right? But when they have quote unquote downtime, they can do individual investigations. And how do they do that? Well, they basically look at social media and see if there's any type of negative chatter out there about an organization. They go to that organization's website and they start poking around. One of the things they're looking for is, do you have a method? It doesn't have to be a high-tech method, but do you have a method to basically entertain individual rights? If you don't have that, and you're collecting personal data, that's a big ding from a regulator, because arguably most of these regulations are basically about affording us, right, as users of whatever that is, the rights regarding our personal data. And if you're not providing that, that's a huge miss that needs to be fixed.
Absolutely. And Paul, all of the AI regulations are being written right now. So they're, I think it's, most of our audience members would not be short-sighted. They're here because they're forward-thinking people. But, I just want to point out, it'd be very short-sighted to think, well, there's no regulations, I don't have to worry about it yet. I'm pretty sure nobody's thinking that. So if you are thinking about it, I can't give legal representation of what's safe harbor, but remember that regulators are people. And
yes,
if you're challenged on something, like, and something hits the news, or all the reputational stuff comes up, it's going to be very important that you can sit down calmly and say, here's our protocol. It's the old, we wrote it down.
yes,
We wrote this down when we designed this, and then we did the following. And walk with me, regulator, through our method. Is it perfect? No, probably not. But compared to others, we've been thinking this through and documenting it. After writing it down, we actually did the things we were supposed to do. And here's all the examples. Here's all the back into my world. Here's all the operational data to support that. And
Yeah.
I'm just offering, again, it's not legal advice, but I can tell you,
Yes.
I work with a number of regulators. That's a very different conversation.
That's a very different conversation. Absolutely. And they prefer that you talk to them before. If you don't have a clear answer, you're not getting clear guidance from counsel, and you're definitely going to be dealing with that regulator or that office to have that open discussion with them.
Yeah.
And
You don't want to be that little kid saying, well, you never told me I couldn't. You're like, yeah, but you kind of should have known you shouldn't. Right.
Exactly.
So you want to have an adult to adult discussion on these matters and be able to say, we thought this through, we wrote it down, then we did it, then we report on what we did. It's part of our process. Let me show you that.
So we're gonna obviously we got a little bit of meat we need to get through. We got about 15 more minutes, Gary. So
sure, we looked at the AI challenges. The point here is that of those who said it was extremely challenging, like it was just 46-47% overall. Some industries, it from their own viewpoint, are even more concerned. We're just listing them here, from telecom, technology, education, financial. It's a concern for everyone out there. We've got a source here. If you share the deck afterwards, people can click on it and see the report, interact a little bit with it, and then at the end, download a white paper. But the point here is that some industries have to be especially vigilant. They already are. These are all highly regulated industries, but AI is one that hopefully they're not panicking, because you've got a method for doing this, but they have to be on top.
okay, kind of looking at that transition. So let's talk about criticality.
Sure. Look, there's different options with AI, right? You can build your own AI model, develop buy the computing power and develop. Some companies are, because then you got your own proprietary set. And then many companies are, either got APIs or what have you. They're integrating existing software out there for their particular purpose. And all the big players are offering this, in terms of the platforms, Google, Microsoft Azure, et cetera. So you can play with other people's essentially protocols and data, and then apply your own, and a hybrid thereof. So some develop from scratch, but most will be taking from large language models that exist, and then they'll be pointing some of their own data perhaps at those capabilities, or they'll be just extracting what they need for their own development. Look, I just want to emphasize this. There's things that may not be your fault, but they are your problem. If those models that you brought, if they're biased, if you didn't think through that some of that data could have been poisoned, that there's some delusions in there, you can't just say, oh, ChatGPT told me so. You've got to be thinking through it. You chose to use it, so it might not be your fault, but it is now 100% your problem to explain if it goes sideways. So we looked at, there's a lot of certifications out there that help us to help companies to stay grounded and have a good process and approach. I just want to point out NIMBY, this from our large global survey this last year, NIMBY framework taken by 19%. So NIMBY is part of what TrustArc offers in terms of a framework. Most large companies or companies of considerable size may use several of these. But if we go to the next slide, what I found really interesting, Paul, was that when we did two things. One is the distribution of, we're going to come back to the NIMBY thing in a minute. The distribution that we're looking at here is essentially this. This is self-reported, by the way. This isn't me coming in as a researcher and evaluating them. We're just asking them a lot of questions, and based on their answers, we create the scale from, actually you could lose points. You could go theoretically from -100 to +100. And it was a very psychometrically valid and reliable measure. About a third of the companies, self-reporting, people are saying, hey, we do an excellent job. A third are doing pretty good. But then a third, look at the tail on this distribution. It's shocking. There's more. There's 10%, 10 or 11%. Like 1 out of 10 companies, people are saying, the line I like to use, Paul, is if I told you I was gonna, hey, look, Paul, I want to share a secret with you. Can I trust you? You'll keep it. And you said, well, maybe. That's the wrong answer. That's the wrong answer, Paul. Maybe is not an acceptable answer. You've got to, I want you to get enthusiastic and say, like, of course you can. Tell me. So with privacy is kind of like that, right? So
Right.
if you're a maybe is a maybe, you lose a mark. I'm not going to tell you my secret if you say maybe. So you're going to lose a mark for that. And it's not just neutral. You actually lose a mark. I'm like, okay, you can't trust this guy. You can't trust this company. They don't have a promise that they're going to keep things private for you. So that's the distribution. They're doing exceptionally. They're doing pretty good. They're kind of doing miserably. And with that in mind, if we go to our next slide, what we did is I correlated the standards that companies deploy against self-reported, and I looked at their privacy competence score in relation to that. And so I just thought this was important to bring to the forefront. Getting back to NIMBY, companies that used it, and I don't know if they used it properly or well. I don't have an opinion other than if you attempted and used it by your own self-expression, individuals from companies that did rate their confidence in being able to keep things private the highest. The second point I want to make here is that do something. Anybody who's used any kind of standard is doing better than a company that doesn't. So, like anything in life, start.
Yeah.
Like our health, right? I don't know, go for a walk. Like I don't know, not all need to look like Arnold, but get out there and go for a walk. Take care of yourself. Companies are the same. Like adopt a standard, a framework, make it part of your process that you do things. But among all of these, I think you've got to be pleased, Paul. It's just the data speaking.
Yeah.
NIMBY people used companies that use NIMBY framework scored highest in terms of their privacy competence.
And talking about the NIMBY framework. So if people are not familiar with it, it was the first privacy framework established back in 2015. So this predates NIST. This predates, the FedRAMP stuff. This predates a lot of the frameworks that people have come to use. But this was the granddaddy of them all. And it was put together by a group of 500 experts in the privacy industry and regulators. It was taught in a couple of universities at one point. And again, what you see here, and I don't expect you to read it all, is there's about 145 different activities broken out in these 13 categories. The idea is not to do every one of them, but the idea is this is an a la carte based on these categories that you can pick from, dependent on where you are in your privacy journey. You may just do 2 in each one of these categories to start. But to your point, Gary, it's a start, and you got to start somewhere. Now, thankfully, we've updated this and continue to freshen it, and we've now updated it to reflect basically the AI functionality. And here's a few things that you have called out as part of that.
Absolutely. So again, cognizant of time, but all 4 of these are so critically important. We discovered, over a third of companies, it's probably more, but a third have had some sort of significant data breach. I think that's incredibly high, on our global survey. Got to be really careful because the AI can collect a lot more data than you even think you're collecting, and that creates exposure for you. You got to be able to interpret it and encode data in a way that helps protect against that. And then I think for all of us, we always think from the consumer perspective, but also from a workplace perspective. Workplace surveillance. Some of the stuff is great. You can help with people's health and safety, but on the other hand, it can be invasive, and you can step over the line. So I think what the AI collects and making sure that you maintain the standards of good workplace ethics and employment law. Again, AI creates a new sort of exposure surface to companies that they need to be aware of with this capability in hand.
So this next slide, and I won't spend too much time on it, but it obviously, a couple of these things that you see that are highlighted are the changes that we've added to deal with AI specifically. So each one of these categories has some specifics related to either actually a couple things. One, AI and ethics are both kind of being called out now in the framework. So it continues to evolve, right? It continues to evolve with the change in environment and time. We'll obviously, as things change, if necessary, we'll come back to this and continue to change it. But I seriously would encourage anyone that has not looked at the NIMITY framework or hasn't looked at it in a while to take another look at it, because it'll solve a lot of, or it will guide you in solving a lot of the issues that you may be confronted with today. As it did back in 2015. I certainly used it when I was at Kellogg. I know a lot of Fortune 200 companies still use it. So I don't want people to think, oh, this is only being used by, small companies. That is not true. Some of the largest companies in the world built their programs on this. Why? Because it was the first one out of the gate. And it works. That's why. Okay. So kind of getting into some of these next steps. I want to, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but other than to say, like Gary said, you have to start somewhere, right? Whether you are using spreadsheets or technology, low tech, high tech, whatever you want. Obviously, there are different benefits, obviously, when you're using technology, obviously, particularly for revalidation purposes or, kind of easy reporting and documentation and so forth. But that said, the goal is, particularly when you're starting out, is figure out what your risk is internally and externally. Is it with your systems? Is it with your vendor partners? Is it, is it what you're collecting? You really have to get to understand your risk. Once you understand the risk that is caused, that is, being caused, and bucket into high, medium, and low, tackle those high risks first, right? Those are the ones that are going to hurt you the most reputationally or financially. And obviously, we have tools, as this demonstrates, that TrustArc has built to do those very things. The other thing is, this answers one of the questions out there from someone anonymous. Basically, once you understand where those risks are, and they're high risk, most regulations, privacy regulations, require you to do some level of due diligence thereafter. A lot of people, like if you were doing something in Europe, they call it a DPIA, right? A data protection impact assessment. And that's what it is. It's not saying you can't do something. It's simply saying, look, you're engaged in something that is considered high risk. AI is a high risk by everyone's definition today. It's a high risk. So you need to interrogate it up front. Ask the question, are you collecting personal data with this? If you are, there's other questions, what type, and, are we the owner of this, or are we just doing the processing, right? And then you need to do and conduct a PIA that has leverage questions specific to AI functionality, right? And so that's what you see, and TrustArc is built in to its PIA process, these AI questions. And so and it's all logic based, right? If you ask the question, are you using AI? And the answer is yes, then boom, 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 right? You're going to get these different questions, right? If you're not using AI, you're not going to get asked those questions, type of thing. And then the last thing, of course, in the entire assessment process and methodology is complete the remediations. Then you can close that, right? And go to your next one. But you need to fulfill what is the risk, be able to identify that should you ever get tapped on the shoulder by a regulator, and then be able to basically demonstrate what you did in order to reduce the risk and exposure to the individual or the data subject's personal data. And that kind of, cycles the whole thing through. There is one question that we'll answer right now, and one of them, this comes from Craig Erickson, who asked, "What makes NIMITY better than NIST?" Comprehensiveness is the simplest answer I can give you, and we'd be happy to demonstrate that by just giving us a jingle or contact me directly. We have the material on this. We can show you how NIMITY stacks up against NIST, GDPR, OECD, the GAP principles, CCPA. We can show you that this framework is much more comprehensive, covers much more than any of those. So if you want to build something that is going to solve for many regulations, NIMITY framework is what I would recommend a serious consideration for a company or organization. And I know Gary, we're kind of out of time. With that,
stay for a few more minutes. I want to respect the audience. I think it's worth pointing out that you've got like 90 plus templates, TrustArc, many where applicable, these have been updated.
Yes,
for the new world we live in with AI. So maybe just hit on a couple that I've been following the questions, and I think you've answered most of them as you've gone through these. But
yeah, these are certainly, obviously you're going to get the deck. These are solutions that we have, but it's something to take a look at. Particularly obviously the assessment that includes AI, as Gary was talking about, the operational templates you see here on the right side. All those things have been updated to incorporate AI in there. Obviously, our research continue to do enormous amount of work in that area. Obviously, Privacy Central, which is kind of a unique offering in the marketplace, where we particularly have, we have NIST in there. You have the NIMITY framework in there. You can benchmark how you are doing against these different frameworks. ISO's in there. And SOC's in there. So there's a number that you can compare against in a rather simplistic way. I'd like to, kind of close, Gary, if I will. Obviously, thank you, Gary, for all the work you've done. It's great information, and certainly appreciate your perspective on all of this, and encourage you to come back as you continue to dig into more and more of this information and share it out. On behalf of Gary and myself, thanks for joining us, and have a pleasant remainder of your day.